So, hello everyone. My name is Roman Nurik. I'm a Android developer advocate, much like Rado. You probably were just at the session that Rado just gave. I kind of work on user experience, user interface. I kind of specialize in that area. I kind of consider myself a designer, a web designer, graphic designer, now kind of UI designer. But I also work with developers such as yourselves and designers as well. So this talk is actually going to be slightly geared towards UI engineers and designers. So you'll probably benefit if you're on either side of the coin. And at the bottom, you'll notice that I really care about icons. I care a little bit too much. I'll probably be mentioning icons here and there throughout the session. And we'll have some interesting things to talk about with icons. And if you get annoyed at all with the amount of icon stuff that goes into the session, then feel free to leave or yell at me on Twitter saying, enough with the icons already. All right, so let's get started. User experience. Before we jump in, I want to ask you the question, I guess, where does the user experience begin? Many people think that, many developers can get themselves in the mindset that the user experience starts with the user interface. So, as soon as the user installs the application, jumps into it, and starts using it, using your buttons, using your tabs, that is the beginning of the user experience. Well, I don't think that that's necessarily correct. I think that the user experience actually starts much earlier, potentially, somewhere like an Android market. So really, the user experience begins the very first time the user has any sort of, I guess, familiarity or exposure to your application or brand. So it could start in something like Android Market, when they do a search for, say, music, and your application comes up if you're a music application, and they see your icon and your title and your kind of like your name. Could also start, if you're really lucky, something like on TechCrunch or Engadget or whatever, right? It can start in a blog where if your application is good enough, it can get picked up by a blog. Maybe they kind of feature it in a screenshot in an entire article saying, oh, by the way, everyone, this application just launched in Android Market. So that could be the first time that the user kind of first sees your application. And where does the user experience extend to? Now, I don't want to say end because the user experience doesn't really end. Users don't really stop thinking about or somehow having a memory or some sort of cognition about what your brand or application is like. So where does it extend to? What is kind of the continuation of the experience after apps, after they use your application's UI? Well, it goes beyond just application UI, right? It goes into things like reviews. If they use your app and like it, they'll go into Android Market, and they'll give you a 5-star rating or a 1-star rating or something. It can go into recommendations. So if the user really likes your app or really, really doesn't, they'll tell their friends about it, tell their family. And that's kind of word of mouth. That's also part of the experience. That's a continuation of one user's experience and the beginning of another's. So that's potentially another way that users can learn about your brand. There's also forums and support, right? So if a user has a bug or a feature request, the way in which you deal with that, the way in which you provide tools to help them cope with their issues, that's also part of the experience, and that can actually change your kind of rating, how users can see, perceive your device or perceive your application. So unfortunately, we're not going to talk about a lot of the stuff that I mentioned. We do have a blog post that's out, and I'll point you to it at the very end, that talks about kind of the beginning and end. Today we're going to talk about a few things in the beginning and kind of the core middle part of the application user interface. First, we'll talk about the first impression. We'll talk about the market search listing. We'll talk about a couple of other things in the first part of the user's experience. And we'll talk about designing for ease of use, and specifically around how to make an application that is easy to use, clear, consistent with the UI, or consistent with the system, and makes a lot of sense so that users can jump right in and feel like they're at home. Next, we'll jump into some UI design and dev tips, and this will be particularly helpful for UI engineers, as opposed to, say, designers. Then we'll talk about new tools, some new tools that we recently made available that'll help both designers and developers actually kind of create UIs that really make an impact. And then we'll talk about, lastly, very, very briefly, how to continue to impress the user. So let's begin. Making a great first impression. The first thing that you should be thinking about in terms of impression, right? The first thing you should focus on is setting the right expectations and impressing the user as soon as possible, in a positive way, of course. So setting appropriate expectations means making sure that the first time the user sees your app or learns about it, that's positive and it's professional, right? You want adjectives like, oh, polished, high level of fit and finish, professional, feels like a real app, effort, You want things like that being said versus negative things. So the way you can start doing that is, like I said earlier, in the market search listing. Have a great icon, have a beautiful, professional-looking icon, one that is, one that matches the system, and in some ways, also is very clean and crisp, so the user can very clearly see it and see there's a degree of professionalism in it. Also have an appropriate listing title. We'll see an example of this in a second, but it's actually really easy to try to kind of game the system by tweaking your title here and there. But users will perceive that, and they'll think it's dishonest. And lastly, the description. We'll talk about this in a second. Actually, right now. So on the left, you see here kind of an example of what we believe is a kind of a positive first impression, and on the right, a negative first impression. The differences are really in the icon, the title, and the description. Three very, very basic things. Things that you're probably scratching your head about and saying, why are you even talking about this? It's so simple. But the thing is, they're often overlooked. Because the thing is, sometimes there's a tendency to try to tweak the title, tweak the description, so that, for search engine optimization, or so that, you kind of, push yourself up in the rankings. Now, the important thing to note is that users actually think about this. They actually look at the title and look at the description and immediately can kind of guess what kind of application it is. Is it an application that was kind of built by one person in his garage or something, which is fine, with no effort involved? Or is it kind of a group of people that put together kind of a concerted effort into making something great that users will love? So differences are things like having a clean title. On the left, you have something like your app, which makes sense, right? I mean, if you're a music service, maybe like Pandora, it should say like Pandora or Pandora Music, not something like your app free title, free music, blah 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 blah, right? I'm not going to go into whether or not that actually works in gaming, the search system, but basically, even if it does, I don't believe that it does, but even if it does, just know that when users see something like that, they'll think this is not going to be a great app because they're trying to game the system. Then the icon, very clean and professional, and blurry, not following our guidelines. Users will see that and say, if I install this and I put it on my home screen, it's going to kind of feel out of place. This may be a subconscious decision, right? Users don't always consciously decide on these things, but these are kind of immediate snap decisions, snap judgments that are made in the subconscious, where users are saying, this is something that's good and this is bad. So you want to be on the good side. And lastly, the description. The description here is pretty short and concise. It's to the point. It gives the user just enough information to make that decision, that really snap decision. And it's also short enough to kind of hint that there are screenshots available. A lot of users will scroll up and down, but most users are just flicking through, just looking at apps, right? So you want to make it immediately clear that you have screenshots. And by the way, make these screenshots beautiful. And you want to make it obvious that it's this is a professional app. We have screenshots available. This is what you can expect. And you don't want to do something like this, right? Where you have, first of all, supporting only one device or something. That's a whole different story. But you don't want to say things like that. You don't want to kind of jam all the information possible in those 325 characters that are available, because you want to give the user enough information and no more. So that's a very brief set of guidelines for the market listing. There are obviously a lot of things you want to do to make sure that your brand is well kind of placed and well well shown. So the problem is, though, that you don't always have control over the first impression, right? like I said earlier, users can recommend your app to others. That's something that you don't really have control over. Press, like whether or not you get covered in a blog, that's not something you really have control over. Also, if you're an existing service, you may not, actually users may already be using your app. So you may have a web service, right? And your mobile app is kind of like the mobile extension of that service. So users will have kind of existing exposure to the brand, and they'll have an existing set of expectations. So what you don't want to do is have a great web service, have a really, really absolutely terrible Android app or iPhone app or anything like that, and have the user kind of negatively, you don't want to have that negatively influence the way in which the user perceives your brand, right? So you want to have something that meets the expectations of your brand or exceeds them. And lastly, market ratings. Obviously, these are kind of difficult sometimes. Users can be brutal, as Rado mentioned earlier. And these are also things you can't control. But I guess the point of this, it's all kind of looking bleak a little bit, but the point of this is that the thing that drives all these things in a positive way, directly or indirectly, is app quality. So improving the quality of your application is much better than, say, kind of pushing advertising, throwing advertising into it, right? Driving impressions. What you want to do is make sure that your app is quality, that you present it in the best way possible, and that you kind of give users and the press the tools with which to present your application in a beautiful way, in a positive way. So I guess that's the very first impression. The next thing, let's say you do get installed by a user, is you want to look into that first setup process, that first time process. So as soon as your app is installed, you want to get the user up and running as soon as possible, quickly. They want to get to your content. As few barriers as you put into place between the user and their content, the content they want from your app, the better. So in the case where you have a sign-up process or kind of a user login system, first of all, if it's a login, try doing an auto login, right? I mean, if you're using something like Google App Engine, there are ways in which you can use the existing Google account on the device, on Android 2.0 and higher, to automatically log the user in to their account. So you don't have to actually ask for a login and password. And also, if you require a registration process, which you probably should make available in your app, make it as short as possible, and pre-populate it. Pre-populate fields if you can. For example, things like creating temporary passwords and having the user, giving the user the ability to change them in the future, versus having them to think of a password and type it in later. That's very important, because it minimizes the number of keystrokes the user has to do just to get started. So that's kind of one kind of optimization metric, number of keystrokes, right? You want to minimize that to get started. If you absolutely have to have a registration process, try to keep it to something like 2 fields, or maybe 1 field, or 0 fields. If possible, even better, don't have them register at all. Have them, give them some content and kind of almost upsell them. Not really upsell in the sense where they have to purchase something, but upsell and say, actually, if you want to reach this piece of content, you have to sign up. So that actually works pretty well. And this is actually common not only on mobile devices, but also in the web as well. So once you have the user logged in and registered, you want to sync immediately. You want to be able to recreate their state on the desktop or their existing service state, either on the desktop or a mobile device, or another mobile device. Recreate that on their new device as soon as possible. What that means is you want to implement things like sync adapters. You want to implement things like the backup API that's available in Android 2.2, so that the user immediately sees their information, their personal information, filtering in and populating their app. So the idea here is that if I'm a user, I don't want to have to recreate my context. I don't want to have to say, here are my Gmail labels. I have to create a new set of labels in my mobile version. Or here are the labels that I find most important, or here are my settings, and have to kind of reset that up, because there's just more and more friction. That's a lot more, more barriers to entry. So once you have the user logged in, registered, you have everything synced, this is kind of the crux. This is where your this is where your kind of your UI begins. This is the thing that now the user, day after day after day, week after week, they'll be using your application. They'll be kind of using that UI for the rest of their kind of exposure to your app. So it all starts with that first activity, kind of that home screen or that home activity, if you will. The point here is make this home activity as easy to use, as straightforward as possible. So the user, the first time they jump into it, they should immediately understand what your app is good for, what it's useful for, and what kind of features you offer. It's also a great way to show off your brand. So if you're a highly branded service, if you have a great logo, this is a great place to put it, to make it, I guess, to put it front first, right? If you have an existing visual style, if you have a kind of a visual language or a design language, make it obvious here. So in this case, this is the Google I/O 2010 application. You can see that these, the icon is in the top left, and all of these icons, they're styled in the kind of the Google style. That's part of our kind of visual style. So you want to make that clear. You want to immediately brand the experience so the user kind of feels like they're using an extension of your brand. It's also a great place to, to start being consistent, right? So if the system has certain patterns, or other applications have certain patterns, which we'll actually talk about, you want to start using those immediately to give the user an immediate understanding that if I do this, I know that this is going to happen. So make things straightforward. In cases where your home activity or that first experience isn't as clear as you'd like it to be, for example, let's say you have a really complex interaction. In this case, this is Winamp for Android. This is recently launched in Android market in beta. What they have is they have the standard kind of getting started screen, but they also have this kind of interesting pattern where if you drag up this bar, if you slide it up, it'll show the currently playing songs. Now, I believe that what they thought was that not all users will immediately understand this. It's not the most common pattern on Android to see you're now playing. So what they decided to do is when you first jump into that screen, when you first jump into the app, they'll show you kind of an immediate tutorial screen, and not really a tutorial screen, but kind of a legend for the UI. Now this is not something that you want to use for every single UI. I mean, if possible, you want to make a UI that's immediately understandable without any sort of explanation. But if you do have to have an explanation, make it really straightforward like this. This is an immediate way to start communicating with your user. Again, to give them the expectation that they're not alone. They're not using your app, in the dark, right? If they have questions, they know that the developer, is thinking about them, right? So you're explaining things, you're giving them potentially options like in settings or help. You're kind of communicating with them. This is a great way to kind of establish a positive relationship with your users. So this is just a kind of a zoom in on what they show. And in this case, the iconography is fairly straightforward, but some users may expect different iconography. So in the absence of things like tooltips on touch devices, it may be a positive way it may be one way actually to show off what certain iconography means. And if you do provide a tutorial screen, by the way, make sure that it's also available in like settings or help. So kind of replay that tutorial screen at any point. This is another example of a great tutorial screen. This is the Google Goggles application. So Google Goggles is an app that lets you, take your phone, point it at like a landmark or something, take a photo, and then using all the Google goodness, Google, I guess, reverse search goodness, you can find out kind of what that is. So there's a problem with this, right? This technology is great, but it doesn't work with everything. For example, it doesn't work with animals. It doesn't work with hamsters. If I take my device and take a photo of my pet hamster, I mean, Google Goggles shouldn't be expected to show, as a search result, Sparky, pet hamster, right? So setting this expectation, setting this standard will give the users an idea of what can I expect to use and what can I expect what can I expect to work and what can I expect not to work. So, this will take care of potentially, many support requests where, the title is, for some reason Google Goggles can't scan my pet hamster. What's wrong? And you'd be surprised. A lot of users have certain expectations that aren't realistic. But then again, a lot of users of Android these days are not technical. They don't realize what are the boundaries of the technology. So educate them on it. Don't necessarily tell them everything, but give them kind of a rough idea of what they should expect. This is also a great place if you have something like live wallpapers or widgets or global search to inform the user about that. So right now, Android unfortunately doesn't provide the greatest user experience for informing users of available widgets, for example. One way you can alleviate that is to show, by the way, we have a widget. Here's how you add it. On most Android devices, it's on the launcher screen, it's menu add. You can talk through that and potentially kind of give them ideas on what to expect from the widget or what kind of functionality in the app is available in the widget. So that's kind of the first impression. That's everything from learning about the app to installing it to signing up and to actually begin to use it. So let's talk about navigation and specifically ease of use. Well, actually the other way around. So clarity is what you should be striving for in your applications. Don't necessarily strive for absolute simplicity. Strive for clarity, making a clear and straightforward user interface. And the way you do that is it's really kind of simple, right? It starts in the very beginning. First, think about what is your information, what are the objects that you're working in. If you're a developer, you've probably already thought about this. You've probably created kind of like an entity relationship diagram or kind of a rough object model. But really laying this out in terms of what objects the user will be interfacing with, having that clear and very explicitly laid out, that's the very first step. I know this is pretty obvious, but oftentimes it's kind of overlooked. Next, think about the primary UI navigation pattern. So depending on the structure of your information model, whether it's really wide or really tall, you may have to pick different UI navigation patterns. We'll talk about this in a second. Finally, begin sketching your UI. Sketching or otherwise prototyping, meaning if you have something like OmniGraffle or a prototyping tool, which we'll show an example of in a second, you should start thinking about doing that. And do this, by the way, way before you start coding. A lot of times there's a tendency to start jumping right into the code, and you end up with a UI that you kind of threw together, and you leave it there and you ship. That's not a great way of thinking about a user interface. User interface should be kind of the first thing you design, first thing you work on. After this, there's a whole bunch of steps that involve working with designers to actually get the visual assets created, working with designers to get the layouts structured and whatnot. So we're not going to talk about that though. If you have questions after, we'll take them. So let's jump into UI navigation patterns. So like I said, once you have your information model, you have to pick a UI navigation pattern. Here are a couple that are good patterns, and here are some bad patterns. We'll talk about them each in a little bit of detail. First, we have the dashboard and action bar. Who knows what the dashboard and action bar are? We've been talking about this for about a couple of months, but raise your hand if you know what that is. Okay, a couple of you. So I'll kind of jump through that pretty quickly. We'll then talk about tabs, things to do with tabs, things not to do with tabs. We're not going to talk about the actual visual design. We'll just talk about the interaction. Then we'll briefly highlight some do's and don'ts with respect to, actually some don'ts with respect to navigation and kind of on-screen affordances. So first, dashboard and action bar. So for those of you that haven't seen this pattern before, this is called the dashboard. The dashboard is usually the home screen. What it shows is a list of features or sections of the app that are available. This is great for really wide information models or data models where you have a large number of different types of things. So in this case, you have things like people and places and photos. Those are all fundamentally different types of objects. Now, the dashboard is a great way to show off your iconography and show off your brand, but it's also a great way to show something that's new. So this rarely changes. The top part of the dashboard rarely changes in your app. But the bottom part is a place to, since you have usually some space left over, in that, some vertical space left over, it's a great place to show something that's new or the most recent changes in an app. So for example, you can put things like, the latest news feed item. You can put the latest photos that are available. You can put things like the latest scores if this is a sports app. You can put also other things. Potentially, maybe not latest, you can use also things like latest favorites or just favorites in general. At the top, so that was the dashboard. At the top, you see the action bar. Now, this is kind of designed as a replacement for the title bar. For those of you that have created Android applications in the past, you've probably seen that kind of gray title bar at the very top. It's not very useful. I mean, it just shows the user where they are, but it doesn't let you do much else. It's kind of counter to a lot of other platforms, for example, the web, where a lot of the navigation is at the top. It's kind of, that's where they expect to be able to navigate their device, their UI. So we'll talk about the action bar in a little more detail. Let's do that. So the action bar is a replacement for the title bar, like I said. It gives the user a sense of place. It tells them potentially where they are, but more where they can go and what they can do. So generally, there's two ways of using the action bar. You can use the action bar, the same one, kind of the one that we just showed, throughout the app, all the way across your app. What this really should do, if you use this pattern, anytime you click in the top left, or actually you can see this here as well, anytime you click in the top left, that should take you back to that dashboard or to the home screen. Okay? So the reason for this is that the user, no matter where they are, they know that they can always go back home. If they get lost in the app, they can always go back to a safe place, a place that they know, if they press home, instead of having to press back a whole bunch of times. The dashboard is the action bar is also a great place to show common functionality using action buttons. So if search is one of the most important parts of your app, or if, say, composing a tweet is a very important and ubiquitous part of your app, you can make these available in the action bar so that the user, no matter where they are, they know that they can do kind of a search or a compose or something like that. So you can use this top action bar, this one example, or you can use different variations throughout the app. They can change slightly, but really the user knows, I guess the crucial part, the user knows that here's where I go home and here's the common functionality. So here's some other examples of the action bar that you can use. You can use, instead of your logo, you can use kind of like a home icon. You can use something like this, kind of like a dashboard icon. If you do have a dashboard, you can use that. Or you can have an iconic version of your logo as well. And in some cases, it makes sense to still show kind of the current title or the current place where the user is. So that's the dashboard and action bar. Highly recommend using this pattern. It's very, very good for complex applications where navigation can be almost cluttered sometimes. If you want to simplify navigation, if you think that you have an app that's very complex in terms of the information model, you may want to consider using this pattern. Next, let's talk about tabs. I'm guessing that most of you at some point or another have created something that uses tabs. So we do have a couple of guidelines for what to do with tabs. First of all, try to keep tabs at the very top. Don't use bottom tabs. There's really two reasons for this. First of all, there's an element of consistency involved. Now, Android, a lot of applications on Android use tabs, and the truth of the matter is that they're all at the top. So if you want to be consistent with the platform, then make sure that your tabs are at the top. The second problem is, if you notice here, in case of a bottom tab setup, you have a lot of interaction going around in this region. So the user's finger is going to be traveling in this tiny little area very, very often, almost like every couple of seconds or minutes. So what you'll end up having there, the problem you'll end up reaching, is that the user will accidentally press back, accidentally press menu, accidentally press home, which kind of sucks, and accidentally jump through different sets of tabs. So what you want to do is you want to not have that happen. The problem is that a lot of Android devices, well, not the problem, but I guess the truth is most Android devices right now, this is the form factor you're working with. It's not to say that at some point in the future Android devices can have menus, buttons at the top, but that's unlikely to happen, it seems like. So those are the two reasons to have top versus bottom tabs. The second thing that you can see in this example is the number of tabs. And for the same reason, you don't want to have that many. You don't want to have anything more than like 4 tabs. Our recommendation is if you have to use tabs, use 2 or 3 or at most 4. The reason is that you start cramping the interaction space, right? So as soon as you start having 5 or 6 or kind of, well, actually I've never seen 6, but as soon as you have more than 4, remember, you're constrained in horizontal space, so the user is going to be making more and more mistakes. And when users make mistakes, they not only feel bad about themselves, but they feel like they're not using your app in a positive way. It's a negative user experience. This all boils down to kind of the fact of kind of interaction size, the size of your UI elements. We'll talk about that in a moment. But having said that, tabs, another problem with tabs, I guess, is that some of the criticisms are that they're not as beautiful as you would like on Android. Remember that this is only about interaction. You can absolutely, and you should absolutely feel free to customize those tabs to fit your brand, to make sure that they look like you want them to. There's obviously a balance between strictly your brand and kind of the operating system look, and it's totally fine to find something in between that looks right. And if you're using tabs, I'm going to quickly talk about this, but if you're using tabs and you're not using tab widget, if you're creating your own set of tabs, make sure that when users switch between the tabs, that pressing back doesn't actually cycle through all those tabs, right? The reason is that you kind of want to keep a small back. You want to keep the back stack as small as possible, and you want to make it kind of straightforward. And again, for consistency's sake, since most activities with tabs, when you press back, it takes you to the previous activity before you even saw tabs. That's what you want to do to be consistent with the operating system. Now, there's also something to be said about scrollable tabs. And scrollable tabs, I'm going to talk about them in conjunction with this other pattern of horizontal swiping. Now, who's seen the news and weather widget on Android, or the news and weather application? Okay, quite a few of you. So the news and weather application is very simple. It has one kind of screen, one main screen. It has a set of tabs at the top that indicate news topics, things like health, entertainment, sports, business, things like that. And it also has horizontally swiping pages, and those actually change along with the tabs. So this is a great pattern, but it's very useful. It's most useful for homogenous content. Cases where your information model is, it could potentially be pretty wide, but it's narrow in terms of type of content. So you only have news articles. The reason for this is that when swiping left and right, you don't want to have to swipe between completely different types of content. The reason for this is that you can run into unexpected cases where you swipe right, you expected one type of content, let's say photos, but you actually jump into something like schedule, right? This can help somewhat, having kind of an indication of what's to the left and what's to the right, but it still doesn't work that great. The best case is when you have homogeneous types of content. So real quick, before we finish on the navigation patterns, those are the only two we'll cover today. There are obviously more, but those are the ones that we really recommend, using potentially tabs or that dashboard and action bar. Really quickly, I want to point out two brief things. If you do use back, and you obviously should, try not to provide an on-screen back button. The reason is that users, before they ever got to your application, they've learned the back button. Assume that the user knows how to use the back button. So there's no need to really provide them with an extra on-screen affordance for back. Second is the options menu. Now this is probably one of the most misunderstood interactions on Android by users and by developers. So really, our basic guidance with the menu button is to only use it for secondary things that you don't really need the user to use the app, right? So having your primary navigation, the main way to get across your app, in the options menu is not a great idea. So what you want to reserve instead for the menu is things like settings or sign out or something like that. Stuff that doesn't necessarily need to, the user doesn't necessarily need to even know exists. So let's talk about prototyping tools. I'll briefly mention paper and pencil, that's obvious. But there's also another great tool that's open source and free called Pencil for Firefox. This is actually at the stage where before you've written any code, before you've created any assets, you want to start thinking about, I have a navigation pattern in mind, I have an information model, what do my screens look like, or what does my app look like? So Pencil for Firefox is great. There's also Adobe Fireworks. I want to briefly show you an example of what Adobe Fireworks can do. So this is a PDF file. It's a PDF file that was generated from Adobe Fireworks. But this is no ordinary PDF file. It actually has clickable regions that you can define in Fireworks that can say, when I tap on this, I should switch to this page. So this is a great way of immediately mocking up interactions. So instead of having kind of a giant printout with this screen points to this when you click on this, you can actually make an interactive PDF using Fireworks. Now, having said that, you can also use Fireworks for the actual asset design. You can actually use it for the mockup, the visual mockup itself, not just for the to show the interactions. But I mean, this is one of the highlights of what you can do with Fireworks. So if you have a choice of using Fireworks, I highly recommend using that for prototyping. We'll show a demo of Pencil for Firefox in a bit. OK, let's see. Where were we? Here. OK, so let's jump into design and development tips. This is mostly for developers, not so much for designers. And we're kind of running a little low on time, so I'm going to skip through all of this. Well, skip through a lot of this. The nice thing is that almost all these slides are available, well, actually, all the slides are available at this URL. Don't worry about writing it down now. We'll have a link at the very end. So some quick do's and don'ts. I'll just talk about the highlights. First of all, don't simply port your UI from one platform to another. And I mean things like iPhone or BlackBerry or Windows Mobile. If you have an existing app, don't just transplant the UI and throw it onto Android. The reason is, like Rado mentioned earlier, before the user ever gets to your application, they've probably used their device and tons of apps, other apps on that device for days, weeks, maybe months. So they're already accustomed to things like the back button, potentially the menu button, the home button, the search button, how those all work. When you port your application from one platform to another, you naturally kind of take those UI concepts and those principles and kind of port them over at the same time. So you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that you provide a UI, a user experience that's as consistent with the system and not kind of fighting the user as possible. Also, don't overuse modal loading dialogues. They add to perceived latency, so when possible, instead of doing that, have kind of a loading spinner inside your list or inside of your activity itself. It really helps in terms of lowering what the user perceives as lag or latency. Also, another pretty obvious thing is when you're actually implementing a UI, don't use pixel units. Remember that there are tons of devices out there that are across a wide, a wide spectrum of densities. What we do on the Android side is we provide you kind of with buckets that you can expect. So you can expect that devices will fall into high density, medium density, or low density buckets. And so what you want to do is use density independent pixels to make sure that everything scales up normally. And we'll talk about later on how providing different assets at those different densities will make things more crisp. Also, don't use small font sizes when possible. Try to stick to things like text appearance small, text appearance normal, text appearance large. When in doubt, use larger font sizes. It'll really really aid the usability of the app. At the same time, make large and obvious tab targets. Remember how I said earlier about the problem with having 5 tabs, for example, or more than that? The function of the usability of an object, according to Fitt's law, usability of an object is a function of the size of that object, the size of that UI element, and the distance your finger has to travel there. So when possible, make things bigger, make things more easy to touch. If you've ever run into this problem, trying to tap something and it's not actually working, you're probably running into a problem where the developer didn't provide something that's large enough for a human to use. Also use proper margins and padding. That should be kind of obvious, but unfortunately our defaults in in layouts, our defaults don't have any margins and padding. And when you introduce new white space, when you introduce negative space, it really helps in kind of presenting your content in a more visually appealing way, in a more useful way. Also support D-pad and trackball navigation. most devices, actually I think all devices right now that are compatible and have Android Market have a touchscreen, but this may not necessarily be the case in the future. In the future, you may have devices that don't have touchscreens and are only navigable with a D-pad. For example, Google TV, that's something that will likely have some sort of emulation of like a mouse cursor or something like that. But you don't want to rely on that. You don't want to have users click around. Users are much more accustomed to kind of up, down, left, right navigation. In terms of the activity stack, the next item, limit it when possible to something like 4 or 5 items. What you don't want to have is kind of like an unbounded activity stack where the user, through normal use of your app, ends up with an activity stack that's like 30 items long. So to get back to either the home screen or something earlier, they have to press back, right? So you don't want to do that. And lastly, handle orientation change. Landscape and portrait, there are a lot of cases where landscape is the expected orientation, and there are a lot of devices that will actually be most useful in landscape. So you don't want to first lock your app into landscape or into portrait mode, and you also want to make sure that when the user switches between portrait and landscape, that you handle that gracefully. Obviously, localize. Make sure that if all your users are in Japan, that you have Japan versions of your strings. We'll talk about how to do this in a bit. And lastly, there's really absolutely no substitute for working with an interaction designer and a visual designer. Sometimes this is one person, sometimes this is multiple people, but really these are kind of two different things, and you should really kind of realize that there's two different steps. There's first the layout planning and the interaction design, and after that there's the actual asset production. And the best thing to do really in both these cases is work with somebody that's done it before. So if possible, if you have the resources, try doing that. So we're running pretty low on time, so I'm going to skip through this. Since most of you, I'm guessing, know the resources framework, who here doesn't know the resources framework? Okay, well, I'll briefly mention basically all your layouts, all your drawables, like all the PNG graphics, all of the localization, all the support for different screen sizes, different orientations. That's all using the resources framework. So this is roughly what you should expect your framework to look like, your resources directory to look like. I'm going to skip through this. The reason, what this really is how to kind of customize a UI element, how to create your own UI element. The way you do this is you provide different PNG graphics in your HDPI and MDPI folders. So you provide, like I said earlier, you want to support devices with different densities, and the way you do that is you provide assets at the right densities. So you provide these. You also have versions that are for all 4 interaction states, default, disabled, focused, and pressed. So this is kind of the way you support D-pad or trackball navigation. You then link these up using something called selector XML. This is actually just an example of a drawable that links to other drawables in different UI states. And finally, you're probably going to have to use 9 patches. So 9 patches, very quickly, they're very similar to CSS3's border image. So it's a way of creating a UI element, or like a graphic for a UI element, that's scalable at any different width and height. But it's defined as one image instead of defining kind of 9 different images or doing it using vector graphics. So I do recommend these 3 concepts. They're very important. If you look in the frameworks/base project in the Android source code, you'll see an example of all of the resources, the system resources that our framework uses. So you'll want to look at that as an example of how to do these things properly. So selector XML, providing different graphics for different states, different densities, and 9 patches. That's pretty much how you create new UI elements, or new UI element graphics. So we'll jump over these, but very quick point, follow the icon guidelines if possible. We have some tools that actually make this incredibly easy. Let's talk about them now. So we recently open sourced this project called the Android UI Utilities Project. What it is it's currently a set of 3 things. First is it's a set of stencils for the Pencil for Firefox tool, which is a prototyping tool, like I said earlier. It's a set of stencils that are very specific to Android. So if you want to create or mock up Android user interfaces, along with Adobe Fireworks, along with sketching. This is a tool you can use. Next, we have the Android Asset Studio. So for those of you that don't actually have graphic design resources, what this will let you do is really quickly throw together icons that are, first of all, consistent with the platform and that look pretty good. And then last, if you are a designer, we have some Photoshop icon templates available. These are all available at this URL, jump/Android UI utils. And if you want to try out the Android Asset Studio to make some new icons for your apps, you can use the Asset Studio right here. So let's do a demo. The first demo I want to show is Pencil for Firefox. So this is a tool that lets you, throw together diagrams and UI prototypes and whatnot. What we've provided at the UI Utilities open source project is a set of stencils that are visible here on the left. So they're very Android specific, as you can see. So here's pretty much how you use the tool. You drag in a frame, then based on what you want your app to look like, you can drag in first of all the status bar, which is pretty common. There's some alignment options that you can use. A title bar, which is pretty standard. Currently, we don't have the action bar and dashboard, but that'll be coming pretty soon. You can then drag in like a tab widget, customize which tabs you have available. Let's say tweets and mentions, and that'll make it the selected tab. You can then throw in like an options menu, customize what's in the options menu, and then as you can see, there's a whole bunch of other things. This actually looks kind of weird at when not zoomed at 100%, but as you can see, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's very specific to Android. So this is a tool that you can use to mock up your UIs. You can then export this to PNG and throw it into Adobe Fireworks to create interactive mocks. One problem with this tool is that it doesn't currently generate your layout XML for you. Again, this is purely for prototyping and for mocking up. But we are working on tools for Eclipse, actually, that will help you work on layouts in the development phase in a very graphical way. The next tool I want to show you is the Android Asset Studio. So like I said, right now, it's most useful for generating icons. So here's an example of how to create a really quick Android icon that you can use for Android Market and use for your actual app. Lets you do a bunch of different things. So you can create an icon that's purely text-based. You can customize all different things. You can make it a circle. Yeah, you get the picture. The other nice thing is that if you have an existing logo, using the new HTML5 APIs that were mentioned in the keynote, you can simply drag that logo in here. Or let's say your logo is something a little different like this, right? You can drag those in there, and you instantly have an app icon for your app. You can use this. You could use the same studio for menu icons, tab icons, notification icons. And in the future, we have planned things that will not only let you make icons, but almost kind of entire sets of styles for your app. So you can kind of create. You can pick a few colors, maybe that are thematic with your brand, and generate an entire kind of set of styles and graphics that you can use for your app. So those were the new tools that we're going to highlight today. And again, there's Photoshop icon templates available as well. Those I'm not going to demo just yet, well, today. So skip to the end. Continuing to impress the user. After you've done all this, you've thought about the entire user experience. You've thought about the beginning and the end. You've thought about kind of the navigation patterns you're going to be using. You've thought about the layouts, the screens. You've done all the interaction design. You've done all the visual design. You have an app already running. How do you then impress the user? How do you kind of improve your app quality? Unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about it today, but what we did do is recently we pushed a blog post that highlighted some key areas in which you could look at that will let you kind of really, I guess, group the categories in which you can improve app quality. So, things like performance. What tools can you use to improve performance? Things like the aesthetics, the interactions. What can you use to improve those? So we have a blog post that's available there that'll show you how to improve app quality, and I highly recommend reading that. So that was it. That was it for, we ran a little long, but let's take any questions you guys may have. And thanks for listening, first of all. And if you have any feedback on the session, please scan that real quick and provide the feedback. But thanks, and let's hear questions. Yes. So specifically with shapes like vector shapes you would define in XML, right? So the general guideline is shapes are, they're great. Having vector graphics is a great idea on the web, on the desktop web. One of the problems with vector graphics is that they take a little more computational resources. On a mobile device, you want to make sure that everything is as fast as possible. So our general recommendation is to use 9 patches instead of shapes if you can. For example, like rounded rectangles, if you want to make a rounded rectangle, sometimes it's just easier to make a 9 patch. And you can use a combination of different color filters to make shapes and then change the colors. If you absolutely need to use shapes, you could totally use them, but just remember that there are some implications in performance. Having said that, that's the current situation. Whether or not in the future we'll have a much better, vector graphic support layer, that may change. And actually, another point here is that you can't really do that much with shapes right now. There's only very, very rudimentary support for vector graphics, since we don't support the entire SVG spec, or actually we don't support SVG right now. It can be kind of difficult. So in general, try to stick to raster graphics, things like 9 patches, things like standard regular old PNGs. But shapes may be something that's more useful in the future. Any other questions? Yes. Is there anything what? Sorry. Oh, OK. So the question was if there's an official kind of set of design guidelines or design manual for Android applications. Unfortunately, right now, we have something, and it's fairly outdated. We're working on an update to our icon guidelines, but that's obviously only a very small part of the story. What we do plan is to update our guidelines, make them more fresh, make them more comprehensive. It's just something that's gonna take a little more time, and so it's not yet available. What I can say is that we do have a bunch of resources like the design tips and this presentation that's kind of very high level. But I can't say that we're going to be putting in a concerted effort into improving our guidelines, and so that when you have a question, when you have an idea, you can really quickly look at the reference and say, this is the right thing to do, this is the wrong thing to do. Having said all that, there's also, when in doubt, if you have a question about a specific interaction or a specific part of your UI that you're not sure about, there are some great Q&A tools out there. One that I would really want to point out is the user interface Stack Exchange. So who here knows about stackoverflow.com? Great. So Stack Overflow is kind of the developer site, but there's also a very similar site called Stack Exchange. If you go to ui.stackexchange.com, you'll see that it's a bunch of designers that are kind of have Q&A and shooting ideas back and forth. So that's another tool in the absence of guidelines, explicit guidelines, but like I said earlier, we are working on improving those guidelines. Yep. Question back there? So the question was whether or not there's explicit support in the Android SDK for the action bar. Currently, there isn't. Currently, the action bar is it's just a pattern. So really, it's something that you can mock up, throw together using like a couple of linear layouts or a relative layout. We do have code examples out there. The best one that I know of right now is the IO 2010 application. If you just go to code.google.com/p/IO-SCHED, IO SCHED or SCHED. That's the best open source example of action bars that I've seen. Having said that, action bars may make it into the framework at some point. It's just a question of whether or not we want to make it formal, right? Another point is that there are some open source libraries, not sample code. There are some libraries out there that show you how to do the action bar. One of them is, I believe, Green Droid. So you can look at that as well in the meantime. Other questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. So 2 questions there, right? So the first question was, the tab bar is great. You have 3 items, but then in landscape mode, they end up huge, right? They end up taking too much space. So one thing that you can point out, one thing I want to point out is if you take a look at the music application, the stock Android music application, when you switch it into landscape, the now playing bar actually becomes a tab. So you can have different views for portrait landscape. That's one example of how you can kind of alleviate that problem. Another thing you can do is you can, if you wanted to, instead of having icon title, if you have enough space, you can do kind of like icon title and do it that way. It's a little less standard, but if it's something that you determine is absolutely necessary to keep the vertical space in your UI available, you can try that. So I'd say tabs, again, I'm not a huge fan of tabs. I think that things are almost always better served with other patterns, but I mean, those are some of the issues with tabs. Having said that, you can also control the height of tabs, right? I mean, and you don't necessarily have to use tabs even in landscape. So there are a number of different options. I'd say it really depends. So the second question was around whether or not we I guess the guideline from Google is to use to customize the look of tabs. I'd say if possible, don't customize them. Unfortunately, that doesn't always leave you with the visual style that you want. So there's really two recommendations. First, don't customize them at all. Or second, customize them completely. Customize every aspect of them, right? What you want to do is actually make sure that the interaction pattern is still obvious to users. Make sure that users still understand how to use them. And the way to really do that is to kind of, like I said earlier, find the balance between what is the right visual style and what is, I guess, like the operating system style. So one thing that I've seen that has worked really well, I'll give you an example, is the RDO application, RDIO. What they've done is they've actually customized the tabs in a very, very light, almost very subtle way. What they've done is that they've slightly changed the colors, very slightly, so that the color scheme of selected tabs or kind of highlighted tabs, as the user presses them or uses the trackball to highlight a tab, they've made that color match their own kind of UI color a little more. So one thing you could really do is take a set of tabs or take the built-in tab assets, the tab graphics, and go into Photoshop and just change the colors slightly to match your UI a little better. So that's one very simple way, but I think it really depends. It's really a balance. Like for example, if you look at the Twitter for Android application, they have tabs somewhere like throughout parts of the app, but they've customized them completely and they've made them kind of look like they really fit in. So really, I guess, leave it up to your designer, but the recommendation is either to customize them a lot in the sense of customize every graphic, maybe slightly, maybe completely, or don't customize them at all. So I guess it's not much of a guideline, but I guess it really depends. Yep. Other questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. So the question was if there's an easy way to change the style of apps, like almost like the theme of apps. Oh, the style of tabs. There's no super easy way. You pretty much have to do everything using like XML attributes. I mean, obviously you can throw these. That's weird. You can throw all these attributes into like a styles XML file, but really it's really just digging deep into the code. So it's not easy right now. I mean, maybe in the future it'll be a little easier, but right now it does require kind of a deep kind of knowledge of the XML behind everything. Yeah. Okay, so I think you're probably all pretty hungry. We should probably start heading out to lunch. If there's any other questions, I'll still be up here for a couple of minutes. I'll actually be coming down. So any other questions, I'll be happy to take them after. Thanks.